Welcome, everybody, to episode number 17 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. My name's Tim Burrows, and I'm going to be the host for today's episode. The title of today's episode is, Have EVs Reached a Global Inflection Point? In fact, 10 million passenger vehicles were on the road at the end of 2020. And with millions more added in 2021, the global market seems finally poised for liftoff. But as always, challenges remain, both globally and in the North American market. Corey Cantor, a transport analyst for electric vehicles at BloombergNEF, joins us to discuss his team's view and long-term outlook for electric vehicles worldwide and in Canada. He will also discuss automaker strategies, commercial vehicles, and recent US electric vehicle policy developments. Corey covers the policy, economics, and the technical factors impacting the electrification of transportation, focusing his research on the North American market. Prior to completing his master's in education, Corey worked for US Senator Cory Booker on his economic team covering policy around banking and taxes and the federal budget. Before that, he researched economic policy for NDN, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Corey received his master's degree in environmental management from Yale School of the Environment and bachelor's degree in political science and English literature from Washington University in St. Louis. So welcome aboard. You know, all of the EV enthusiasts that I know, and including myself, always wonder about that question. You know, when is that inflection point for electric vehicles coming? And so we're looking forward to hear some information around that and your thoughts and your organization's thoughts.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for the opportunity, and to everyone tonight. I'm going to get started, and I'm going to be talking a bit about where we see at BloombergNEF EVs going on a global scale, and then a bit on Canada as well. And I'll do my best to answer that global inflection point question, but hopefully all of you will have some thoughts if we're there yet, or if we're kind of once again having to say, maybe next year. To kind of break tonight's presentation into a few different segments, I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction on what BNEF is. Then we're going to shift over to the electric vehicle sector today, kind of looking at recent history, talking about what's been going on in North America in terms of the latest developments, both in the US and in Canada. In the next two segments, we're going to talk a lot about what we call at BNEF our long-term electric vehicle outlook, EVO 2021. This is kind of our house view on all those questions of when are EVs exactly going to take off, and in which regions are they going to take off first, as well as why we think EVs are poised to begin adopting at higher levels. And then finally, I'll touch on automaker strategies. And this is something really exciting for me, reading the news and kind of analyzing where automakers are going on almost a day-to-day basis now. And we'll talk about how they're approaching the sector and why some of the decisions that they're making highlight how we are at that inflection point. So first, I'll start off with BNEF. For those of you who don't know what we are a subdivision at Bloomberg focused on market research around the clean energy and energy sector overall. We have vast different teams tackling issues around clean power, advanced transport, buildings and industry, as well as agriculture and land. And we don't just cover the normal renewable energy resources like solar and wind. We're also looking at kind of frontier technologies such as low carbon heating and cooling, 3D printing and the circular economy, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, bioenergy, and industrial digitalization. Across all of these different sector areas, we look at strategy and forecast, policy, finance and economics, sustainability, and consumers. We also have a large commodities team. So I work on the electrified transport team, but we will work with the oil and gas team, for example, to show how EVs are replacing vehicles with internal combustion engine, as well as up the supply chain, looking at what metals are required to prompt and accelerate the electric vehicle transition. And finally, we do some work with folks looking at policy globally to say, what are different countries doing to promote electric vehicle growth, and where are the barriers to that growth? BNEF really focuses on helping clients across the kind of broad spectrum of companies, whether you're an automaker, a member of the supply chain, policymakers, or corporates looking to have a more sustainable fleet. So we're engaging with those clients on a day-to-day basis and offering them our research to help them shape their decisions. And everything you're going to be seeing tonight really comes from a bunch of the kind of overall presentations we're giving those clients. So a lot of this is normally behind kind of the paywall, but I'm happy to be sharing it with you tonight. So with that, we're going to turn to electric vehicles today. I'm going to talk a little bit about recent history and then current trends. Electric vehicles have come a long way in 10 years from a minuscule amount of global sales. If you look at the chart here, in 2011, there was less than 100,000 new EVs sold every year worldwide. In 2012, almost 10 years ago, global EV sales hit slightly less than 100,000. EVs have come a long way in 6 years. In 2015, global EV sales hit about 400,000 units. You begin to see different aspects in different regions across the globe showing further adoption of electric vehicles. Europe taking a bit of the lead, the US and China. Electric vehicles have come a long way in 2 years. This is where you really begin to see growth starting to take off. EV sales in 2016 were about 700,000 units worldwide. They more than doubled by 2018 to about 1.9 million sales. And then in 2019, we hit 2.1 million sales worldwide, with Europe and China being leading regions. And you would think in a global pandemic, when auto sales were down worldwide, and there were so many challenges for people all across the globe, that electric vehicle sales would falter. But even during a global pandemic, EV sales increased by nearly a third to 3.1 million sales. And I don't have it on today's chart, but what I can tell you is electric vehicle sales in the first half of 2021 were about 2.6 million vehicles sold, meaning that halfway through this year, we have already more than surpassed the 2019 global EV sales, with Europe and China again being leading regions. This is the same chart, but passenger EV sales by drivetrain. As you can see, battery electric vehicles begin to outpace their plug-in hybrid electric vehicle counterparts around 2017. And in North America specifically, you're really seeing about an 80-20 BEV to PHEV ratio. Canada's EV market has followed the same trajectory. The beginning of the 2010s saw minimal EV sales below 10,000 units a year. Once we hit 2017, EV sales began to accelerate. And in the last 3 years, you've seen EV sales hovering between 35,000 and 55,000 sales annually. What are the drivers of adoption in North America? What has led to that kind of growth in EV sales between 2016 and 2018 and a kind of stagnation over the past few years? Well, we mainly track it to 3 separate drivers of adoption. The first is purchase subsidies. It's no surprise, given that EVs are more expensive than ICE vehicles, that for some consumers, EV purchases were just a little bit out of reach. Both the US and Canada have national purchase incentives. US is $7,500 US, Canada $4,000 US, and of course, 5,000 Canadian dollars. These have helped to get those early adopters and make it a little bit easier to purchase that electric vehicle. The second is fuel economy standards. The chart here shows EV share of sale under different scenarios based on different fuel economy programs in the US. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the point overall is that whether you're talking a kind of fleet-wide CO2 standard like in both countries, or if you're talking about an internal combustion engine phase-out such as what Canada has introduced for 2035 on a national level, fuel economy programs force automakers to drive electric vehicles towards a specific region or a specific country. And then finally, we at BNEF have been optimistic about this region because of two-car homeownership in the US. And again, this ties into Canada and North America overall because automakers will have to build up EV supply chains and EV sales in North America, given the fact that there are so many potential homes that have more than one vehicle, meaning that there are those who may be hesitant to fully convert over to EVs, but given the fact that nearly 60% of US households have 2 cars, it's an open market to at least convince those homeowners to switch over one EV as a starting point. I'll talk a little bit about US federal policy here before shifting more into Canada specifically. And the reason why I want to highlight this is that, again, this is a region as a whole, and the more investment there is in electric vehicles by automakers like Ford, GM, and Stellantis, the more electric vehicles will be shipped over to Canada as well. There's been a lot of debate over the last couple months over President Biden's electric vehicle agenda. Some of it is within his control, and some of it has been beyond his control, and he's had to negotiate with Congress, and those negotiations are still undergoing. The first and most important point, as I mentioned on the previous slide, were around fuel economy standards. President Biden announced an update to the US federal fleet standards for models year 2023 through 2026. According to our analysis, as you can see on the chart on the right, this would result in automakers having to send more electric vehicles to the US market in particular, or face potential massive fines. The way our analysis works is we assume that those automakers do not have the desire to pay those fines to the Environmental Protection Agency. And we also assume that there are only so much improvements on the internal combustion engine to meet those fleet-wide targets. And therefore, to make it up, they would be sending electric vehicles and shipping and developing more here in the North America region. We expect that basically in the US, EV share of sales will go from about 2.3% in 2020 to about 9% in 2024 under Biden's proposed rule, and then by 2026 to about 24% EV share of sales. I'll be talking a little bit about Canada's EV share of sales in the next portion of our presentation. But again, it's important to keep in mind that these fuel economy standards have not been finalized, and therefore when we are looking outward in our research at BNEF, we do not take those rules into account just yet. In addition, the US Congress has been debating 2 additional bills that could have a large impact on the EV sector here in North America. The first is a Senate-passed bill that would include $7.5 billion in charging infrastructure for the US, and perhaps more importantly for the Canadian audience, billions of dollars towards electric transit and school buses in the US. And what that means is for those automakers that, and those e-bus makers here in the North America region, there's a large market share potentially up for grabs. And in addition, a kind of growing e-bus and school e-bus market is beneficial for companies like Lion Electric and Bluebird, for example, that could be seeing growth in the years ahead. Secondly, just like I spoke about the kind of federal incentives in the US and Canada, there could be a second bill that will include further EV tax credit changes that could accelerate the sector here in the US. And again, if you have more EVs on the road in the US, that's helping to drive down the cost of electric vehicles everywhere, just like the EVs in China and Europe have been helping with the overall story of driving down the cost of electric vehicles. Now, one note about these US federal policy changes, and in addition, any policy changes at the national level in Canada, our electric vehicle outlook forecast was published in June. So anything that we're talking about that has come recently, whether it's an ICE phase-out announcement or a kind of US recent policy change, is something that will not be reflected until next year's report. So a few kind of final points on the kind of Biden proposed rule changes. You can see on the slide here that under the previous administration, there was really not much regulatory pressure on automakers to have to ship electric vehicles here, given that the mile per gallon increase was about 1.5% annually. Historically, the kind of growth in fuel efficiency between each model year is around 2%. Biden is asking for about an 8% annual increase from 2024 to 2026. That's how his regulation works. And again, that puts a lot of pressure on automakers to either meet those kind of efficiency increases that become more and more difficult the more and more efficient your vehicles become, or alternatively, ship more plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. Now, again, this is the EV share of sales under those various fuel economy standards for the US. One thing I'll just note is this is an average of battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. If it was an all-BEV kind of automaker strategy, then you wouldn't necessarily need to see a 24% EV share of sales in 2026. It could be slightly lower if it was all BEVs. But again, we expect that Biden's rule on this particular front will be finalized, which will have a positive impact for the region overall. And again, US automakers have a long way to go. These are just US 2020 passenger EV sales with Tesla removed, given that they don't sell vehicles with an internal combustion engine. The point is that while the EV transition may have begun for some, for many automakers in 2020, their EV sales were only in the thousands or tens of thousands. And to date in 2021, you're starting to see that change. But again, whether it's Tesla being the #1 recipient of EV subsidies in Canada, or Tesla being the kind of main EV seller around between 47 and 60%, depending on the quarter you're talking about, in North America overall. These other automakers have a lot of catching up to do if their goal is to win the EV race. Now, finally, the new proposals in Congress I discussed earlier could incentivize EVs even further. You could be seeing the US really outranking other major auto markets in terms of how much it could incentivize electric vehicles. Given that there's only so many EVs to go around every year, is a possibility that automakers would see more demand in the US and it could pull a little bit from Canada. That remains to be seen, and it also remains to be seen if this legislation will pass. But again, the kind of benefit out of this legislation in the US is really for those domestic automakers who have unionized labor, and that's really your Ford, GM, and Stellantis. Now, Canadian provinces have a wide range of incentives, and this shouldn't really be news to some of the folks on this webinar tonight. The question when it comes to both the national and the regional incentives is, are you going to be close enough to that price parity point where those incentives are going to make a big difference? And as recent articles in Canada have shown, various automakers are seeing more and more competition, and they're in turn driving down their own prices. So as we talk about upfront price parity in a little bit, another thing to keep in mind is that these incentives could potentially drive growth even faster if they stay in effect. The caveat is you see in a lot of countries, and Germany and France are one really good example, that as the market gets more and more heated, there is a desire by government to not spend as much. So for example, France had an incentive in place that was about 7,000 euros, and they saw EV share of sales off the charts, meaning in the mid-teen 10 to 15% or so, depending on the quarter you're looking at. And they revised down their EV subsidy, cut it back to 6,000 euros. That's the kind of choices that governments are going to have to make. They may see it more suited towards moving incentives in a used vehicle market direction, given that as EV prices come down, maybe government doesn't want to be spending as much time in that kind of market where people can now afford it. Now, the other part of the story is around charging infrastructure. And one of the tools we have at BNEF is a global public charging infrastructure tool. No surprise to see that public charging infrastructure in Canada has gone from about 6,000 public connectors in 2017 to nearly 14,000 public connectors through the first half of 2021. Most of that is in the mid-accelerated category, about 2,000 fast chargers and about 1,000 ultra-fast chargers. And again, this is part of the story. Are there going to be enough chargers on the road to support the electric vehicle fleet? Because in many different countries, that is kind of the fear, that EVs, in terms of a consumer product, move ahead of the charging infrastructure. There's a bit of a chicken and the egg story that's been going on here for a long time. Again, not much of a surprise. But we see, especially for the next decade, that charging infrastructure will be one of those limitations if policymakers and utilities don't get ahead and begin their resource planning around creating more charging. The good news, though, is that average EV range keeps rising. As you can see on the chart here, if you go back to 2012, your max, maybe best souped up Tesla Model S was over 400 kilometers in range. And some of the vehicles released in model year 2020, we're seeing closer to 700 kilometers in range. We're working on an updated edition of this chart currently. But the key trend here is that EVs are getting more and more battery range, which is good for consumers who are feeling that anxiety. Over the long term, our kind of house view is that you're not going to see range increase indefinitely, because there is that trade-off between how much are consumers going to be willing to pay We do think that there's going to be more of a kind of bifurcation of maybe we'll offer an EV model with less range and then have a couple of super premium models that go even further. So with that, I'm going to turn to our global EV outlook. We're going to first talk about where we see the market going and how we developed our methodology. And then we're going to bring it back to North America and Canada. And of course, our report is called EVO 2021. We've been putting this out since about 2016. And really each year, we've been adding new features to it. I won't go into everything tonight, but the report really circles around kind of 4 key segments: passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles, electric buses, and electric 2- and 3-wheelers. And every year we add new regions to look at. And then finally, we cover things around charging infrastructure, the impacts on oil demand, and emissions. And I'll show you a few of those charts as well. And the good news is we added Canada for the first time this year. So a lot of this information that I'm sharing now was just first published this past June. Now, what is our EV adoption forecast methodology? The way we put together our long-term outlooks is we take into account the demographics, economic, shared mobility services, and autonomous vehicle impact on annual kilometers traveled. And by doing so, we are able to develop a global fleet by type of vehicle. Next, we look at EV range and the EV model availability over the short term, as well as policies in place and upcoming model launches. By doing so, we're able to develop a near-term forecast. So we say, these are the amount of EVs we expect to be sold over the next couple of years. This in turn, using our lithium-ion battery price survey, we're able to estimate when that retail price of EVs will become cheaper than those of ICE vehicles. And this is a really pivotal point throughout the presentation, because once you reach that upfront price parity point, we take price volume maps of each of the regions across the world, and we see what are consumers willing to pay for vehicles at each price. And then we adjust those by EV retail prices in a given year. So using Canadian EV price data, we are also able to estimate a total addressable market for electric vehicles over the long term from about 2024 through 2040. And then finally, using those powertrain costs and demand elasticities, we're able to build out our model with an infrastructure kind of constraint and have annual EV sales that add up to an EV fleet each year. I mentioned before that battery prices are kind of that key component. To date, they really make up around 28% of the overall EV price in the US. And as battery prices continue to fall, that proportion of the overall vehicle cost will decrease. And what that means is the most expensive component of the electric vehicle today will be reduced in cost, allowing automakers to sell EVs at more of a profit and reach that point when automakers say, we're gaining more out of selling an electric vehicle than we are out of a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. We do our battery price survey every December. So our most recent one had a $1 per kilowatt hour at about 137. And our next report should be out for that in a couple months. But again, we kind of observe an 18% learning rate and expect that $100 per kilowatt hour point to be breached in the next couple of years. And then that will increase in terms of the learning rate. And then by 2030, around $58 per kilowatt hour. The really important thing to note about how we look at battery price and upfront price parity is that certain automakers could be ahead of what our expectations are. Certain automakers could be behind. But what this means is that if you reach that $100 per kilowatt hour point, you have a vehicle that is competitive with a comparable ICE vehicle on the market. And as I stated, we put out a report on upfront price parity every year. Now for this, we don't have numbers on Canada in specific, but I think the US will be a useful illustrative point. We divide all of the vehicles on the road in the passenger vehicle segment into 4 subsegments of small, medium, large, and SUV. As you can see here, there are percentages showing how much of the battery cost is made up of each particular segment's vehicle price and how that will fall over time. For example, if you look at the bottom right, you can see that for SUVs in 2020, about 27% of the overall electric vehicle cost was the battery. But by 2024, we expect that to fall to 19%. And then by 2030, it will make up just 12% of the overall vehicle cost as more and more batteries are deployed. So what this means is we expect that in the US, The large and SUV segments will reach upfront price parity somewhere around 2023. And as it pertains to the small and medium segments, that's by 2024 in the US. And again, this is just a kind of best in class, but you don't have to take it from me. If you even look at an article that came out yesterday by the CEO of Audi, he says that electric vehicles on the road by 2023 are going to be reaching what they call profit parity, where it makes more sense for Audi to sell an electric vehicle than an ICE vehicle. And he's saying that that point could even be reached as soon as today. So again, when you look at our work as well as that of Audi or other automakers who have kind of converged, VW saying it's coming over the next few years by 2025, there begins to be that conversation of, well, are we really no longer that far away when it comes to upfront price parity? And so what that means in terms of our forecast is that the global EV fleet will continue to expand. We see that passenger EVs will hit over 50 million units by 2025. E-buses and commercial EVs will reach 6 million units by that year. And there are already millions upon millions of electric 2- and 3-wheelers on the road today, mostly in China and in Southeast Asia. And we expect them to continue to grow, approaching 350 million units by 2025. Now, global passenger EV sales will rise to 66 million units by 2040. As you can see on the chart here, fuel cell vehicles in the passenger vehicle segment don't really come into play until the late 2030s. Hybrids are going to play a key role, and we see them supplementing a lot of the ICE vehicles over time. EVs will reach about 68% of global new passenger vehicle sales in 2040. Now, as you can see in the chart here, we expect that Canada will be the third market after Europe and China in terms of the EV share of new passenger vehicle sales. Of course, Europe and China are far larger markets, but we expect Canada to be approaching that 80% market share by the end of the 2030s. And the global passenger EV fleet will hit about 650 million units by 2040. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles will play a role, but we really do believe that BEVs will begin to supplement them towards the end of the 2030s. I'll quickly note that we also expect that more vehicles will have either level 2 automation or level 4 autonomous features. Really very few of the overall passenger vehicle sales in the late 2030s will have limited autonomy features. And despite all of this growth and the kilometers traveled increasing, we only expect the fleet size to grow by 30% by 2040 and sales to increase by 16%. We really do think that both shared cars like Lyft and Uber, and then later robotaxis will have a strong role to play. Now, how does this all play into that kind of decarbonization question? Well, we're optimistic in terms of our base case, our economic transition scenario. We find that all but medium and heavy commercial vehicles will have a greater than 50% EV share of sales by 2040. So what that means is electric 2- and 3-wheelers are going to be hitting 80% and buses near 80% EV share of sale by 2040. Passenger cars approaching 70%, light commercial vehicles at 60%. Medium commercial vehicles and heavy commercial vehicles are going to need a lot of policy support in order to decarbonize. Now, to meet the growing fleet, more charging will be needed. So globally, we're going to see approaching 300 million connectors at home and work, tons of public chargers, nearly 25 million by 2040. And on the e-bus and truck side, 4 million charging connectors worldwide. Now, EV electricity demand is about 14 to 24% of global demand by 2050. I talked a little bit before about our economic transition scenario. In our annual report, for the first time, we also included a net zero scenario, which is the chart that you can see in the middle. And what these charts are basically saying, not surprisingly, is if you have more EVs on the road, you're going to need more chargers to support them. And that's going to increase a lot of the electricity demand worldwide. In many countries, electricity demand has been relatively flat, but electric vehicles are going to be able to add quite a bit on top of that moving forward. So where might this take us? And this is kind of the crux of the kind of challenge that awaits the globe. The chart on the left shows the avoided emissions by the transition to electric and fuel cell vehicles. And we expect that it's going to lead to about 4 gigatons of CO2 of avoided emissions by 2050. The problem is that there's still tons and tons of CO2 being spewed into the air that year. And if we're going to meet a kind of net zero world by 2050, a lot is going to have to change. As you can see on the chart on the right, you can see our tailpipe emissions. We still end up with about 4 gigatons of CO2 in 2050 under the ETS. In the net zero scenario, we really need to see that kind of liftoff occurring in the late 2030s through 2040s to hit that net zero capable fleet. And so urgent action is needed for a global net zero scenario. While electric 2- and 3-wheelers and buses are on the path, cars and light commercial vehicles are not on track. And medium and heavy commercial vehicles will really require quite a bit of help. The charts that you're seeing here really show what we estimate EV sales have to be pushed up to in order to meet a global net zero scenario. Oil demand will decrease no matter which of the two scenarios I'm discussing or that we're talking about, but it plummets under a net zero scenario. We're talking millions and millions of barrels of oil per day off the road by 2030 and by 2040 to 2050. Now, charging infrastructure growth is going to vary by scenario. Under the net zero scenario, we see it approaching about 700 million charging connectors. In the ETS, it's over 400 million charging connectors. And in terms of the cumulative investment needed globally to meet those scenarios, we're talking close to $1 trillion in our base case and about $1.6 trillion in our net zero scenario. And this could be covered by governments, utilities, and other individuals. But that's the type of Herculean effort it's going to take. So while all of our kind of global projections might be a heavy lift, government policy is slowly ramping up. As you can see, Canada here has been, as of June 8th, in a legislative process around a kind of net zero target. As I mentioned before, Canada does have an ICE phase out target. And it puts it kind of at the sweet spot of countries that are looking to phase out the sales of an internal combustion engine. Canada's target of 2035 is in line with the UK's final target. The UK is actually phasing out pure ICE vehicles in 2030 and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in 2035. The EU overall is looking at a 2035 date as well. And in the US, there are 3 states right now, California, Massachusetts, and New York, which have passed legislation or signed on to kind of an emission standard that will require a 2035 phase out. Norway, of course, is the closest with a 2025 target. So the kind of far out question of when will be the end of this ice age is beginning to become more and more concrete. But again, if you're asking why is this time different, why are we at an inflection point, you might say these targets are way too far and not necessarily enforceable. I will add that British Columbia in Canada is the one sub-region that has a penalty for dealers in place. And that's something that makes its particular ICE phase out, which was 2040, different than some of these national ICE phase outs that are still quite far away. But a tax or a penalty is one way you could hypothetically meet those. I'm going to quickly just go through the North America EV outlook and then kind of finish on automaker strategies. Since we talked about kind of the overall thinking behind our outlook, I'll note that we have various regional breakouts within the report. So we find that by 2025 in North America, there are going to be about 2.2 million electric vehicles sold. And region-wide, that's going to be about 11% EV share of North America passenger vehicle sales. Now, EVs will approach 2.2 million units annually, as I said, but Canada is going to be far outpacing EV share of sale than the US. Canada is going to be approaching 17%, and the US will just be at 11%. Given that Canada has more targets set over the short and medium term, a kind of more generous, I'd say, overall strategy when you add the state and the local, although California in itself does quite well as it pertains to kind of the subnational level on the US side. Now in Canada, we expect EV sales to reach 1.5 million units per year by 2040. The vast majority will be battery electric vehicles, with some fuel cell vehicles and hybrids on the road by 2040. And Canada's EV fleet will be greater than 15 million units. Again, no surprise, talked a little bit about this at the front, but given that Canada's overall vehicle fleet is less than 30 million vehicles, it'll be easier once the kind of pace picks up to quickly turn it over. North America EV sales, meanwhile, will hit over 12 million units each year, 74% EV share of new passenger vehicle sales. Similar story in that fuel cell doesn't play a role until late. And the overall EV fleet in North America will just be under 50%, over 127 million units between the US and Canada. Electric vehicle drivetrains will represent 55% of all distance traveled. To the point around electric and intelligent mobility, what this means is that you're going to be seeing maybe less vehicles than you would expect, but EVs taking up a greater proportion of them moving forward. And then other segments will electrify too. I didn't spend as much time talking about the commercial EV fleet to date, but happy to take more of that in the questions. But we only look at the US for the commercial side, about 8 million units on the road by 2040. And North America's municipal bus fleet, you'll see Canada's e-bus fleet hitting over 80% by 2040, and in the US, about 70+%. In total, though, you'll see about 90,000 municipal e-buses on the road by the end of 2040. And the reason why we see Canada in terms of an e-bus share doing far better is that Canada's 5,000 e-bus target over the next 5 years will really get the ball moving, despite the kind of climate challenges that Canada has in particular around colder temperatures. And then finally, I'll close up on automaker strategies. Just a few slides here, because I think it could spark some interesting conversation. Automaker EV announcements are in the news almost every single day. Whether it's Rivian rolling off their first customer vehicle, an R1T electric truck, beginning the kind of electric pickup truck segment race, Ford jolting the overall auto industry with its $11 billion investment in new facilities in the US, and Rolls-Royce planning to be electric only by 2030. And all three of these headlines I just showed you happened in the news over the past month. In another time, you might say that this is monumental, a kind of first passenger pickup, or a major automaker investing billions of dollars, or a major name saying that they're going to be electric only by 2030. But again, this is only a month in the kind of EV space that we're talking about now. And to that point, if we're at that global inflection moment, if it's not policy, if it's not the current sales, maybe it's the way that automakers are thinking about spending in the years ahead. The chart here shows Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, Stellantis, GM, and Ford, and their kind of percentage investment on electric vehicle and digital R&D. Each of these automakers sees higher than 30%, with GM, Ford, Stellantis, and Volkswagen seeing 50 to 60% in CapEx expenditures over the next 5 years. What this means is that this money that could have otherwise been going towards developing more hybrids or internal combustion engine improvements is no longer going there. And so there is a cost for changing that strategy, but also benefit for the automakers that see the EV transition through. And beyond those expenditures, there's targets and plans in place by OEMs, whether it's those net zero targets, not too different from the country level, whether they're looking at 2040 like GM and Daimler, or 2050 like Nissan, Honda, and Volkswagen. ICE phase outs, we are now up to 9 various automakers that have plans to phase out ICE vehicles sales between 2025 and 2040. And then the last one, ending ICE investment. And what that means is they're no longer going to be spending on any internal combustion engine improvements. You might say ICE phase out, ICE investment, why have both of those categories? But to some extent, when you make an aspiration or a target, you can move it. But when you no longer spend money on something, that's a pretty big change. And that means to restart ICE investment would be quite a challenge and quite a directional shift. And so I'll end with this point here. Every year at BNEF, we do a report that we call AEVS, the Automaker EV Exposure Scores. And what that looks at is really how much of automaker spending is on electric vehicles. Not surprising, Tesla does quite well, given that they're an EV-only automaker with the exception of their solar business. But the one chart I'm choosing to share with you guys here today is around our estimated EV revenue. And as you can see here, it's not only Tesla benefiting from the EV transition. These are EV revenues for 2020. But as you can see, BMW, Volkswagen, Daimler, Geely, and others were making billions and billions of dollars in EV revenues based on just their sales last year. And as I stated at the beginning of this presentation, globally, we're already higher than we were in 2019. More and more EV revenues will be coming in the years to come. And for these automakers, it'll be seen as more and more of a lucrative segment to be playing in. For them, you can't necessarily wait too much longer before transitioning to electric vehicles or face the potential that you're left behind. So with that, I'll end and say that not only do we at BNEF cover some of the topics I've discussed today, but we do a lot more on commercial vehicles, a lot more on the implications of EV adoption. We compare our forecast to other major firms to talk about how far off we are or how ahead of the curve we may be on where we see the EV sector going. And then finally, we talk about the impacts and the inputs. There's been a lot of conversation around the chip shortage, for example, or the battery supply chain. These are the questions that we have teams covering and the impact they'll have on EVs moving forward, as well as hydrogen and its role to play in the future. So with that, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join me tonight. I will stop the screen share and switch over to Q&A. I know I went through a lot of different topics here, so happy to go back to any slides and looking forward to some of the questions.
Thanks, Corey. I'm going to now pass the microphone over to Jason Arnaud. Jason, would you, looks like we have some robust questions going on here, so I'll let you have at it.
Hey, Jason.
Great, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Corey, for the presentation. First question from Glenn is, with regard to North American trade, are Canadian and Mexican autos still considered as American-made under USMC and the Biden administration's point of view?
So I have to go back and look at UMESCA, and I will not, definitively say how the new kind of subsidies would treat Canada in terms of vehicles made there. To my knowledge, the Made in America requirements haven't changed from the kind of Trump administration, but we're still waiting on kind of the final language in that legislation. To be honest, that's something that could be cut out in a final bill, whether or not that kind of increased domestic adder or union labor adder will still be included. So what I'll say is, to my knowledge, nothing has really changed in a significant way, but I'd have to see final legislative language that, again, is kind of being negotiated now.
Okay, great, thank you. Going across the Pacific, when do you foresee the first Chinese EV company start selling into North America?
Oh, that's a good question. And we have a great Chinese analyst that I almost would want to punt the question to her. I mean, we do see NIO doing quite well, and we do see Chinese automakers beginning to look at Europe in terms of their first kind of excursion beyond China. I think the challenge with North America, beyond some of the trade and kind of global issues between North America and China, is that Europe might be a more appealing market in the short term to kind of shift to. So, I'm keeping an eye on NIO, but and BYD for their kind of overall size and scope, and not just on the passenger vehicle side. BYD does quite well in terms of e-buses in South America and in the US, in North America in particular. So I guess I go with both of those. But again, I think Europe will probably be, I think we've seen around 10,000 sales, if I recall correctly, from our most recent report. There's, I think, a little bit more of a kind of political question around that. I can even speak to some of the concern that BYD has on the busing side around some of these new kind of e-bus provisions in the US, the kind of concerns of being locked out due to being Chinese supported OEMs. Given that in China, you have massive subsidies for their kind of home companies that will not phase out until 2022 for not only passenger vehicles, but for commercial EVs and e-buses. So there's kind of it's a more tangled question in North America than one would think. But those are the two kind of automakers I keep an eye on.
Okay. From Patrick, how does the longevity of EVs compare to ICE vehicles? do we expect a robust battery pack replacement market?
Yeah, so I mean, most of the EVs that we see have about a 10-year warranty on the batteries themselves. There is a bit of a kind of early adopter issue in the, I'd say more of a problem with the early kind of 2011 through 2016 EVs. Because again, as I kind of showed on that range chart, the batteries are getting better and the kind of automakers are getting better and better at making EVs. One actually interesting kind of Canada-specific story, when we do our long-term electric vehicle outlook on the e-bus side, we really do it from the ground up level to see how sales are doing. And some of the Canadian e-buses that were purchased in 2016 did not have the proper insulation for the batteries, leading to major loss in range due to the colder climate. Kind of early companies trying them out were just not given the kind of proper protections that were in place from about 2018 onwards. And that highlights kind of that early adoption problem, in that some of these automakers just wanted to get the EVs sold and had kind of less of those protections in place. But over time, we do see, the warranties being in place being helpful, and a more robust used EV market will kind of require more battery replacement schemes in place. Again, that's something that's changing pretty rapidly. And there's a ton of questions around who owns the battery and who's liable for it that has kind of held up EV battery swapping schemes in the past. But it's one of those issues that we anticipate will be worked out over time.
Great, thank you. Doug asks, research and reporting organizations can be influenced by the nature of their revenue sources. Can you tell us more about BloombergNEF's funding?
Yeah, sure thing. So we're a subdivision at Bloomberg, and just like Bloomberg overall, they sell terminals. We sell subscriptions to a bunch of clients at kind of like a standard contract rate that I'm not privy to on the analyst side. What I will say is that we always pick our own research. I guess the one caveat is sometimes whether it's a kind of country or a policymaker might say something like, we're interested in price parity, like, will you write a report on that? And I think it's been more of the kind of, I'd say, groups for kind of a COP or like a major kind of European conference than an individual client. The vast majority of all the revenues, one is either coming from Bloomberg terminal sales, which isn't directly related to our research beyond that you can access BNEF content through the terminal, or just a kind of basic client subscription, as opposed to a kind of think tank or a different structure where you're relying on those donations. It's more of a kind of subscription membership service. And as I said at the top, our clients are everything from automakers to policymakers to, for example, Department of Transportation, Department of Defense, and Department of Energy in the U.S.
Okay. Where do you foresee electric cars with flexible charging timing improving grid stability, incentives to do so, vehicle to grid, etc.?
Yeah, so I've done some personal research around EV home charging tariffs, and not personal as in for myself. It's one of the topics I've covered because each of the analysts basically on the EV team have different research areas. And you really do see, particularly in Europe, different charging tariff structures put in place to encourage that flexibility. For example, it kind of creates more of the relationship between the EV owner and the utility to a kind of energy management relationship, as opposed to I'm going to plug in at a time of use. So what that means is the utility might say to a consumer, we're going to guarantee that you will be fully charged by 7 a.m., but we're going to control throughout the night or throughout the day when you're charging and discharging. But in return, you're going to be paying a lower per kilowatt hour price than you otherwise would. Some people might not like that. They might just opt to stay with time of use. But at least when I've spoken to a few utilities like Octopus Novo Energy in the UK, what they've said is, one, the battery degradation is not that high. And two, once consumers kind of have that app on their phone where they could see if their utility is charging or discharging, they become a lot more comfortable with the relationship. Whether or not we see that shift over time in that kind of near term, I think it's unlikely, but we do plenty of studies on vehicle to grid and see it becoming more of an option as we head into 2030s and so forth.
Okay, Keith asks, and I think you touched on this, when do you think drivetrain cost parity battery versus ICE will occur? Many are predicting 2024.
Yeah.
Does your EV market penetration number take this parity into account?
Yeah, 100%. And that's where we really see the kind of adoption on an annual basis really accelerate. So for the US, it's 2023 for some segments and 2024 for the rest. When it comes to globally, the problem or the challenge is in some markets like China, small and medium vehicles are really inexpensive to make on the internal combustion engine side. So that's where you would see EVs lag a little bit. But in North America, that shouldn't be an issue. By mid-decade, we expect to see that price parity point.
Glenn asks, considering that Tesla has to date and intends to continue annual growth of 50%, meaning 20 million units in 2030, how does that impact the Bloomberg assessment?
Oh man, 20 million units. Are they saying on a 20 million on like an annual vehicle basis? Or, I mean, so I'll give a number. It's from our most recent AEVS. I think Volkswagen was at about 9 million vehicles sold. What I always say, or at least what I find really funny in a lot of the kind of conversations I've had recently, is we've seen Tesla go from almost, I'd say, overhyped in the sense of they hadn't put out the massive vehicles to what you would expect of a major car company. I'm talking back in the 2017 days of the X and the S, to now almost underrated in that you're seeing the Model Y and Model 3 selling, I believe it was 240,000, well, Tesla overall, 240,000, I think, vehicles last quarter, but the vast majority being the 3 and the Y. When we're doing our long-term outlook, we're not necessarily saying this amount will be by Tesla, this amount will be by VW, Ford, et cetera. So, it is possible that things could begin to accelerate even further than the forecast I just showed you. That being said, there's only so many passenger cars sold every year, and that number really hasn't changed too much on a global level with the exception of the pandemic. So I think what may be more likely is that you'll see certain automakers no longer be able to compete if the world really transitions over that quickly to EVs. It will be exciting to see Tesla break that million vehicle mark. Maybe that comes as soon as next year. We consider kind of major automakers in that kind of large volume category to be over 4 million units. So I think if Tesla were to arrive at that level of EV shipment, then that would be very interesting.
Great. I'll see how many more we can squeeze in before Tim chimes in. Colin asks, all of these projections appear to assume that electrical power is somehow available to charge these BEVs. Is this realistic?
So we do have charging infrastructure limitations built in, particularly in the 2020s to 2030 period, which is why we don't see EVs taking off even more so than we show here. I won't speak too much to charging infrastructure in terms of how we model it out. We do have a charging infrastructure guru who could kind of speak to his modeling out more. But what I would say is, in the next short-term period, there isn't too much of a challenge of, based on the kind of countries with more EV adoption than we have here in the US and in Canada. In the UK, for example, they were at I think they were 11% EV share of sales in 2020. And in Europe overall, I think last quarter we saw 17%. They're not seeing the major issues yet. But again, it's something for everyone to be, I think, concerned about in terms of more investment in charging infrastructure. The numbers I showed earlier, what we really believe will be required to meet the fleet that I've shown you.
One more, Jason.
One more? Okay, last one is Nick. Do you have any general comments or observations about Toyota and EV roadmap? I assume that means their EV roadmap.
I think what I'll say is that basically, Toyota has been doing very well in the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle space. And in North America, the US and Japan in particular, we do see plug-in hybrid electric vehicles playing a role. So for example, the RAV4 Prime and the Prius Prime have been selling quite well. And they have been, amongst the leaders of PHEVs in the US. Again, they kind of have a kind of pro-hydrogen desire. And we at BNEF do think that hydrogen will play a role in those kind of commercial vehicles, in e-buses for those longer bus routes where you don't want to necessarily charge that large battery if you're doing a kind of coach bus based on the current technology. But our kind of house view is that battery electric vehicles do have a ton of benefits in terms of that increasing efficiency over time. And so, if you're not investing in that space, you do have the potential of being left out of it, especially if countries like the UK say, we don't want PHEVs anymore. And then if you haven't invested in battery electric vehicle technology and you can't sell PHEVs and hydrogen has yet to take off, you could be in a really challenging spot. So I think that's what I'll say at that end.
Okay, great. Thank you, Corey. And my apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't manage to get to. Thank you for submitting them anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Wish we could do more time, but we have to keep it practical and respect everybody's day timer today. But yeah, Corey, thank you very much. That's a fantastic overview. We're already seeing a lot of positive feedback to the material that you've presented. You've really kind of shown us where things stand with EVs globally and in Canada, which of course we all care deeply about too. It's interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see what regions miss the mark in terms of underestimating the rate of EV adoption. I think there, as you say, there are all these, you describe so many different factors at play here. It's very difficult for anyone, even with your expertise, to be able to sort of quantify that. But one of the things that will happen, I predict, is that the point will come when people realize that their ICE vehicles are depreciating so quickly, they want to get rid of it. And that's going to speed up EV adoption in its own right, just that realization. So, but thank you very much. Outstanding presentation.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Hey, Jason, and thanks again for taking us through the Q&A. It's as usual, you did a great job.
No problem.
Yeah. So for our next episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars, we are scheduled for November 2nd, same time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. The speaker will be Samuel Bruneau, president and founder of JAGA Motors. JAGA is a Canadian-based company that's reinventing the off-road landscape with breakthrough electric vehicles, including snowmobiles and watercraft. So if you're into e-recreation and all the potential that electrification has for that sector, you won't want to miss next month's episode. Thank you all for joining us for today's episode, and from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society. And until next month, please stay safe and stay healthy. This concludes the webinar.